Vala was used to being in control. A young scout for the Zrithian military, she had been trained from birth to fight, to survive, and above all, to trust her instincts. Her species had long viewed humans as a bloodthirsty, unpredictable force in the galaxy, a race whose hunger for war knew no bounds. The Zrithians had survived by learning to strike first, to crush those who posed a threat before they could act. That's why Vala volunteered for this mission. A simple reconnaissance operation on a distant human-controlled planet. She would infiltrate their borders, gather intel on human movements, and return home with valuable information for her commanders. It should have been easy. But the jungle on the human world was nothing like the harsh training grounds back home. It was thick, alive, and far too quiet. Every step Vala took felt like it was being watched, the shadows hiding threats that weren't immediately visible. She moved cautiously, her senses on high alert, and her pulse steady. A true Zrithian warrior never let fear cloud their judgment. Her mission was simple: enter, observe, and leave undetected. She had crossed the human defense lines without issue, using the cover of nightfall to slip past their perimeter sensors. The human forces had clearly underestimated her, an error they would soon regret. But just as she reached the clearing where she would collect the data she needed, the world around her exploded into chaos. She felt the presence before she saw it, something large, fast, and ferocious charging toward her from the underbrush. Instinctively, she dropped low to the ground, drawing her weapons, but she wasn't fast enough. The creature, something like a cross between a giant predator and a venomous snake, lunged at her with terrifying speed. The first strike landed on her arm, sending a shock of pain through her body. Vala snarled and retaliated, slashing with her blade, but the beast was relentless. Every time she cut, it seemed to adapt, the creature learning from her movements, predicting her next strike. Outnumbered and surrounded by a pack of these relentless monsters, Vala fought with every ounce of her strength, but the odds were too great. The leader of the pack lunged forward, catching her off guard, and in a split second, her world went black. As her consciousness faded, one thought remained clear: she had failed. For the first time in her life, she was powerless. This keeps the reader on edge, introduces some danger right away, and sets the stage for Vala's journey of unexpected survival and shifting perspectives. Let me know what you think. Vala's eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she noticed was the absence of pain. It was unsettling. Her senses had been trained to detect every scrape, bruise, or cut as soon as it happened. But here, in this place, there was nothing. No cold sting of blood, no sharp pang of muscle pulled too tight. She sat up slowly, her head swimming, and immediately reached for her weapons, but her hands met nothing but smooth, cool fabric. Panic surged through her chest. Her pulse quickened as her eyes scanned the room. A small, sterile space with clean white walls that hummed with an artificial energy. There was no sign of the jungle, no predators lurking in the shadows. Only a faint antiseptic smell filled the air, something that reminded her of a Zrithian medical ward, but far too human. Her breathing quickened as the reality of her situation hit. She wasn't dead. She wasn't in a Zrithian medical station either. She had been captured by humans. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped inside, tall and lean, wearing a dark uniform that resembled military garb. His face was sharp, with short cropped brown hair and a pair of striking blue eyes that regarded her with a kind of detached curiosity. He didn't look like any of the soldiers she had imagined, no fierce, brutish creature that she'd been trained to fear. He was calm, collected, almost human. He glanced at her briefly, then turned toward the medical equipment beside her. "You're awake," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "How are you feeling?" Vala's instincts screamed at her to lash out, to defend herself. She might be weak, disoriented, but she was not helpless. Not yet, but there was something in his demeanor, something that didn't fit the image of the bloodthirsty human she'd been taught to expect. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't attacking. He was concerned. "Where am I?" she demanded, her voice harsh and strained. "What have you done to me?" The man didn't flinch. Instead, he looked down at her with a faint, almost apologetic smile. "You're safe," he said simply. "I found you after the ambush. You were in pretty bad shape. We've been keeping you stable." Vala's heart raced as she processed his words. We. It wasn't just him then. But who else was here? She tried to rise, but a wave of dizziness hit her, and she collapsed back onto the bed with a groan. The man, Commander Hayes, as his uniform read, stepped forward, moving with a kind of controlled precision that made her uneasy. "You need to rest," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through a lot. Let me help you." Vala gritted her teeth, her body screaming for action. But for once, her mind couldn't argue. She needed information. She needed strength. For now, she would stay still. But she wouldn't trust him. Not yet. This section intensifies the mystery, while starting to introduce a level of complexity to Commander Hayes. It leaves Vala in a vulnerable position, unsure of her captor's intentions, which keeps the tension high for the next chapter. Let me know what you think. Vala's days in the human facility blurred together. Patches of pain, fractured moments of sleep, and fleeting conversations with Commander Hayes. Each time he entered the room, she instinctively bristled, unsure whether to fight or submit. Yet every time, he respected her space. Never once did he force her to answer questions or demand anything from her. His treatment was methodical, his care disarming in its simplicity. He fed her, gave her water, and adjusted the bandages around her arm, where the venomous wound still lingered. She couldn't deny that her body was healing faster than she expected, though it grated on her to admit that his methods were effective. But despite his kindness, or perhaps because of it, Vala couldn't trust him. Humans were deceitful. They had to be. Her entire life, she had been taught that kindness from a human was a ruse, a tactic to lower their prey's guard before the knife came down. If Commander Hayes had any real intention of helping her, why hadn't he told her more? Why hadn't he explained what was happening to her, or why she had been brought here? "Why am I here?" she demanded one evening, when the silence between them had grown unbearable. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. "I'm not a prisoner. You said you saved me, but for what purpose?" Hayes, sitting across from her in a simple chair, regarded her for a long moment before answering. His face was impassive, but she noticed the tension in his jaw, the weight of some unsaid truth hanging between them. "I didn't bring you here to imprison you," he said slowly. "You're not a prisoner, Vala. You're safe for now. That's all I can say." "Safe." Vala spat the word out like it was poison. "From what? You keep me in a cage and call it safety." "I didn't lock you in," Hayes said, his tone still calm, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "You're free to go if you want to, but if you do, they'll kill you, and I won't let that happen." Vala's heart skipped. "Who? Whoever's behind the attack on you. They're not done." Hayes leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his gaze never leaving her face. "They knew you were Isrithian scout, and they're not just targeting you. They're targeting anyone who stands in the way of the war they want to start. You're not just caught in the crossfire, Vala. You're part of something bigger. You're the key to stopping it." Vala's pulse thudded painfully in her ears. Her mind raced. The predators from the jungle, the ambush, the humans' mysterious peacekeeping efforts. It didn't add up. She had been trained to believe that humans were the instigators of war, the destroyers, the ones who pushed the galaxy to its breaking point. But Hayes wasn't acting like an invader. He was acting like a protector. "You think I can stop them?" she scoffed, trying to mask her confusion with contempt. "I'm just a scout. You've got the wrong Zrithian." He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "No, Vala. You're exactly who needs to stop them." Hayes paused, his voice lowering, as if trying to make her understand the gravity of what he was saying. They're not just humans in this conspiracy. It's a coalition. Mercenaries, rogue factions from multiple species. And they've been manipulating us all to keep the war going. They'll use anyone they can. Zrithians, humans, anyone willing to fight. Her mind buzzed with the weight of his words. She had never heard anything like this before. It wasn't just humans who were playing the game. It was the entire galaxy, and they were all pawns in someone else's plan. But the mercenaries, rogue factions, that didn't sound like the neatly packaged enemy she had been taught to hate. "How do you know this?" Vala asked, her voice quieter now, despite her best efforts to remain defiant. "Because I've been investigating them," Hayes replied, his gaze steady. "I've seen their operations up close. I've watched them use propaganda to turn entire worlds against each other. And they're getting close to setting off a war that will tear everything apart. I won't let that happen. And I won't let them use you as a pawn in their game." Vala's mind reeled. The idea of humans and Zrithians working together, of stopping something far bigger than any single race or faction, was an impossible thought. She had been raised to believe that the blood of her enemies was the only solution, that violence was the only way forward. But Hayes was offering her a choice, to fight alongside him, to prevent a war that would destroy everything. The possibility of peace, of something other than endless combat, felt alien, but as she looked into Hayes' eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Determination, a flicker of hope. "I can't promise you I'll help," she said finally, her voice thick with hesitation. "But I'll listen. For now." Hayes nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. "That's all I need. I'll show you the rest of the truth, when you're ready." Vala lay back on the bed, her thoughts racing. She didn't trust him, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe him. It was the most dangerous feeling she'd ever had. This continuation deepens the intrigue, shifting the dynamic between Vala and Hayes from adversarial to tentative cooperation. Vala is beginning to question everything she's been taught, which sets the stage for the internal conflict that will define her journey. The next day, Vala's instincts screamed at her to leave, to break out and find her way back to Zrithian territory. Hayes had given her the option, after all. He had said she could go. But deep down, she knew the truth. If she left now, she would never make it out of human-controlled space alive. The mercenaries who had ambushed her would be waiting, tracking her every move, ready to finish the job. And whatever else Hayes had said, the conspiracy behind the attacks wasn't something she could ignore. The room she was in was still small, but the weight of silence between them felt heavier than ever. Vala sat on the edge of the bed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if expecting an attack. But Hayes didn't return. Hours passed, and Vala's frustration grew. Finally, the door opened, and Hayes stepped in, his face serious, his expression unreadable. He was wearing his tactical gear now, dark, utilitarian, with weapons holstered at his sides. His posture was different, more rigid, like someone preparing for a mission. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The mercenaries found us. They've got a team on their way here, and we don't have much time." Vala's heart skipped a beat. Mercenaries. Already? She had expected this, but it still sent a cold shock through her system. She'd heard of their reputation. Mercenaries without loyalty, without honor, driven only by profit. They wouldn't hesitate to kill. "What do you mean, move?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You can't possibly expect me to just follow you. You have no idea what you're asking me to do." Hayes' eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "I'm not asking you to follow me. I'm telling you that we need to leave now. They'll be here within the hour, and I'm not letting you die over a mistake I made." Vala stood, her limbs stiff from days of recovery. "I didn't ask for your protection." "I know you didn't," Hayes replied. "But I'm giving it anyway. So unless you want to end up as dead as the rest of the scouts they've taken, you'll come with me." There was no more time for hesitation. Vala's chest tightened as she realized he wasn't bluffing. There was no escape from this. If she stayed here, she would be captured, and whom knew what would happen then? Her people wouldn't risk coming for her if they thought she was compromised. And even if they did, she would still be alone. She nodded stiffly, but her mind was racing. "This is insane. I'm trusting a human." "Let's go," she said, her voice colder now. She might not trust Hayes completely, but the reality of her situation was clear. If she didn't cooperate, her future would be a short, painful one. Hayes gave a brief nod, his eyes scanning her face one last time to make sure she wasn't about to change her mind. He turned quickly, heading for the door. "Follow me," he ordered, stepping into the dim hallway beyond. Vala followed without question, her senses heightened. The human facility was far quieter than she expected. No loud alarms, no hurried footsteps. Everything was too controlled, too calm. It made her uneasy. She had expected chaos, confusion. Instead, it was as if they were moving through a ghost town. They passed through a series of halls, and when they reached an elevator, Hayes punched a button on the control panel, and the doors slid open with a quiet hum. "Where are we going?" Vala asked, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the blade at her waist. "We're heading for the underground hangars," Hayes replied, glancing over at her. "We've got a ship waiting. It'll take us out of the immediate danger zone." Vala felt a small flicker of hope, but she didn't let it show. This wasn't the time for hope. This was the time to stay alive. She had to keep her focus. The elevator hummed down, and the tension between them thickened. Hayes was calm, but Vala could see the tightness in his posture, the way his hand hovered near the sidearm at his waist. She didn't need to ask why. He was ready for a fight, and he was preparing for the worst. As the doors slid open, they were greeted by a tense silence. Hayes moved quickly, taking the lead, and Vala fell into step behind him, her senses alert. The underground hangars were sprawling, filled with ships of all sizes. Most were civilian, low-profile models, but scattered among them were the larger, more heavily armed vessels, warships, the kind that made her pulse spike with anxiety. But Hayes was already moving toward a small craft tucked in the far corner, sleek and unmarked, its engine still warm. Without saying a word, he boarded and Vala followed, her heart pounding in her chest. As the hatch sealed behind them, Hayes activated the controls, and the craft began to rise into the air, leaving the human base far behind. Outside, the sky was darkening, the stars a sharp contrast against the inky blackness of space. "Where are we going?" Vala asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hand still clutching the sides of the seat. "To the last place they'd expect us," Hayes said, his voice calm. "I'm going to show you the real enemy, Vala, the ones who want this war, and we're going to stop them." Vala's grip tightened. The path ahead was uncertain, and the danger was far from over. But as the ship sped into the unknown, she couldn't help but wonder, could this human truly be trusted? And, more importantly, could she trust herself not to fall into the same trap of hatred and suspicion that had defined her life for so long? The only thing Vala knew for sure was that the galaxy was on the brink of something much bigger than any single war, and somehow she and Hayes were at the center of it, bringing Vala and Hayes into the heart of danger while hinting at a larger conspiracy. It also emphasizes Vala's growing conflict, both external and internal, as she decides whether to trust Hayes and the choices they're about to face together. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence between them as they broke free of the atmosphere. Vala stared out the viewport, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing with questions. The space beyond the ship was vast and black, dotted with distant stars. But it felt suffocating. Too many unknowns. Too many risks. Hayes sat at the controls, focused on navigating the ship, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers moved with practiced precision over the controls. He wasn't just calm. He was prepared for something she didn't understand yet. "Where exactly are we going?" Vala finally asked, her voice betraying a hint of frustration. "You've said it's a safe zone, but I need to know where we're headed, Hayes. I'm not following you blindly." Hayes glanced over at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "We're heading for an outpost. It's off the grid, a place where the mercenaries and the rogue factions won't even think to look. It's the last place anyone would expect us to be." He paused, his jaw tightening as if he was holding something back. "But it's not just safe. It's where we can get the information we need to take down the real enemy." "The real enemy," Vala repeated, her eyes narrowing. "You still haven't told me who they are." Hayes sighed, his hand steady on the controls. "I wish I could give you more details, Vala, but the people behind this aren't just mercenaries. They're orchestrating the war from behind the scenes, playing all sides. They've infiltrated political networks, weapon suppliers, even some of the highest military ranks across the galaxy. If we don't stop them, they'll keep the war going indefinitely. For profit, for power. They thrive on the chaos." Vala shook her head, disbelief and suspicion flickering in her chest. She'd heard rumors before, whispers of powerful factions pulling the strings from the shadows. But this was different. Hayes wasn't just speaking of isolated groups. He was talking about an intricate web of influence, a conspiracy that spanned across multiple species and governments. "They want to profit from the war?" Vala asked, struggling to wrap her mind around it. "So they don't care about the lives lost, the planets destroyed. They just want the bloodshed to continue." "Exactly." Hayes' voice was quiet, but there was a fire behind his words now. "The mercenaries are just pawns. So are we, to them. And you, your people, your military. They've been manipulated just as much as the humans have. Both sides have been played." Vala's mind reeled. She had always thought of the war as a clear-cut conflict, one side versus the other, her people versus humans. Simple. But Hayes was telling her that everything was a lie, that their enemies were hidden, manipulating both sides for their own gain. If what he was saying was true, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something far more dangerous, exposing a truth that could shatter everything she'd ever known. "Then why trust me?" she asked, her voice low. "Why bring me into this? I'm a scout, Hayes. I'm trained to fight, not tow." She faltered, unsure how to finish her sentence. "Because you're not just a scout," he said, his tone firm, as if this was something he had thought about long and hard. "You're an insider. You have access to intel that could help us infiltrate their operations. I'm not asking you to fight for us, Vala. I'm asking you to help us expose them, to use your position to uncover the truth before it's too late." The weight of his words hung in the air, settling around them like a heavy fog. Help them. The very idea seemed absurd. She had been trained to distrust humans, to believe they were the enemy. Yet, standing here now, in this small, dimly lit ship, Hayes was asking her to do something she had never considered, to work with the very people she had been taught to hate, to stop the war, not by fighting, but by uncovering the truth. "I don't know if I can do that," Vala admitted quietly, the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I've been raised to fight, to kill, to protect my people, no matter the cost. I don't know how to stop a war by exposing it. That's not what we do." "I know," Hayes said softly, his gaze not leaving the view ahead. "But maybe that's exactly why you're the only one who can help." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the ship's engines, the occasional beeping of the instruments, and the distant expanse of space that stretched out before them, cold and infinite. Then Vala spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we need to do?" Hayes turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. "We're going to find the evidence, Vala. And when we do, we'll take it to the right people. We'll make sure the galaxy knows who the real enemies are, and we'll stop them, together." For the first time in days, Vala felt a spark of something other than fear or anger, something like purpose, but it was still buried beneath a mountain of doubt and confusion. Could she really trust Hayes? Could she trust herself? Her people had been taught to survive by fighting, by destroying the enemy. But now, Hayes was offering her a way to fight without bloodshed, a way to stop the war before it consumed everything. She had no answers, only questions. But for the first time, she was willing to take a step toward finding them. Deepens the stakes and the moral dilemma for Vala, showing her conflict between loyalty to her people and the possibility of a different way to end the war. Hayes offer challenges everything she's ever known, and it's clear the journey ahead won't just be about stopping the enemy, but about transforming who she is and what she believes. The ship's soft hum echoed in the quiet cabin as Vala and Hayes settled into an uneasy rhythm. Vala stared out the viewport, watching the stars pass by in streaks of light as they headed deeper into uncharted space. Her mind, however, was anything but calm. It was a storm of thoughts, each one crashing into the next with increasing force. The choice Hayes had laid before her was like a gaping chasm. One wrong step, and she could lose herself entirely. "Just a few more hours," Hayes said, breaking the silence, his voice steady but tinged with the same tension that had been with them since the moment they took off. He glanced at the navigation screen, then back at her. "You're doing the right thing, Vala." She met his gaze, her eyes hard. "I'm not so sure about that. You're asking me to trust you, to trust humans." Her voice was quiet but firm, as if the words themselves were a challenge. "I'm a soldier, Hayes. I'm not some diplomat. I don't know how to fix what's broken. I only know how to fight." Hayes looked at her, unflinching. Fighting isn't always the answer. Not when the enemy is hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. If we keep fighting the same old battles, we'll only end up in the same place we started. We need to stop the people making the wars, not just the ones fighting them. She gritted her teeth, trying to hold on to her resolve. He's right, but that doesn't make it any easier. The idea of fighting in a way that didn't involve bloodshed, that didn't involve direct combat, felt alien to her. It was like trying to fight without weapons. Her entire identity had been built on the understanding that survival was won by force. Vala turned her attention to the instruments around her, the technology she didn't understand. "So how do we stop them? If they're hidden everywhere, how do you know we'll even find them?" Hayes leaned forward, his brow furrowed, as he typed a few commands into the ship's console. "I've got a contact, a source who's been leaking intel on their operations. They've given me some information, but we need to dig deeper. There's a facility out here, on the edge of the system, a black site. It's where they're keeping the most sensitive data." Vala's gaze snapped back to him. "And you think we can get in? What if it's a trap?" "It could be," Hayes said, his tone blunt. "But it's the only lead we have. We've got no choice but to risk it." The silence stretched between them as Vala processed his words. A black site. It sounded exactly like the kind of place where secrets were buried and where the truth could be lost forever. But it was also a chance. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. A chance to finally understand what was really going on and why everything she knew was being turned upside down. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, the skepticism in her voice impossible to hide. "I do." Hayes didn't elaborate. His confidence was unsettling, but it was also something she hadn't seen before, a kind of certainty she hadn't expected from him. They sat in silence again, the weight of what was coming pressing down on Vala's chest. There was no way to know what they would find at the facility. She could easily end up walking straight into a trap, or worse, walking into a deeper layer of the conspiracy she had no idea how to combat. What if I can't do this? What if I'm in over my head? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft beep from the console. Hayes' fingers danced across the controls, and a new set of coordinates appeared on the screen. "We're almost there," he said. "Prepare yourself, Vala. It's not going to be easy." Vala's stomach tightened, But she nodded. She wasn't sure she was ready for this. But then again, she wasn't sure she had any choice. The truth, the real truth, is out there. And if she didn't do something to find it, she would be trapped in the lies forever. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered the outer rim of the system, moving toward a series of faint signals on the radar. Hayes adjusted their course, expertly dodging incoming debris and stray satellites. As the ship moved closer to their destination, Vala's mind sharpened, her senses alert. She wasn't just walking into danger now. She was walking into the heart of the unknown. The feeling that had been gnawing at her for days intensified. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about changing everything. "You ready?" Hayes asked, turning to her with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Vala stood up, adjusting the strap of her weapon across her chest. "Ready as I'll ever be." The ship was now just a few minutes away from the black site. Hayes punched in the final set of commands. The tension in the cockpit was thick enough to cut with a knife. Neither of them spoke as they prepared for what lay ahead. Vala's gaze flicked once more to the stars outside. They were closing in on the unknown. And for the first time, she didn't know what awaited them. But one thing was certain. The journey she had started was far from over. And the enemy they sought would be even more dangerous than she had ever imagined. We see Vala grappling more with the internal conflict of trusting Hayes and following a path she never imagined. The high stakes of their mission take center stage, and the tension builds as they head into unknown and potentially deadly territory. Vala's decision to move forward is a pivotal moment, suggesting that she may be starting to accept that sometimes the only way to win is not by fighting, but by uncovering the truth. The black site loomed ahead, a dim silhouette against the expanse of stars. The ship's engines hummed steadily, cutting through the silence of space. But Vala could feel the tension thickening in the air. Every breath felt heavier than the last, the reality of what they were about to do pressing down on her shoulders. They were no longer just playing in the margins of the war. They were about to walk straight into its heart, and they might not come out again. Hayes had already plotted their approach, using every piece of data at his disposal. The black site wasn't a military base. It wasn't even listed on any known charts. It was a ghost, hidden from official records, masked by layers of encryption. If Hayes was right, it was a hub for the shadowy forces manipulating the war. "This is it," Hayes said quietly, his voice steady but tight. He glanced over at Vala, his expression unreadable. "Once we dock, we're going in fast. No time for hesitation." Vala nodded sharply, her hand tightening around the hilt of her blade. They had no backup, no reinforcements, just the two of them against whoever, or whatever, was waiting for them inside. The ship passed through a narrow asteroid field before reaching the darkened structure floating in the distance. It was a massive fortress-like installation, its jagged silhouette rising out of the emptiness like a rotting tooth. The surface of the facility was pitted, scars from years of neglect and disrepair, but its purpose was unmistakable. It was made to withstand anything, to be impenetrable. "You sure about this?" Vala asked, though she already knew the answer. There was no turning back. Hayes didn't hesitate. "We don't have another choice." He guided the ship toward a hidden docking bay on the far side of the facility, its entrance obscured by the debris field surrounding it. Vala tensed as they approached, watching for any signs of movement. The ship's sensors were on high alert, scanning for any unexpected threats, but the silence of the place was unnerving. Too quiet. As the ship touched down with a soft thud, Vala's stomach clenched. This wasn't just a recon mission anymore. They were about to uncover secrets that could either shatter everything or seal their fate. Hayes turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "You stick close. We make it in, grab what we need, and get out. Fast." "Understood." Vala adjusted her weapon one last time, her pulse quickening. They had no idea who else might be here. Guards, mercenaries, or worse. But she wasn't about to back down now. The hatch opened with a soft hiss, revealing the cold, sterile interior of the black site. The air was thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and something else, something metallic, as if the entire place was a tomb for forgotten secrets. Vala's eyes darted around the room as they stepped into the dimly lit hall. The walls were lined with data terminals and control panels, most of them inactive or deliberately disabled. There were no sounds of movement, no signs of life. It felt abandoned, yet she knew better. Something was wrong. "We're not alone," she muttered under her breath, her instincts screaming at her to move. Hayes raised a hand, signaling her to stay quiet, then motioned toward the far end of the hall. "Keep your eyes open. The intel we need is in the central command room. If we're lucky, it'll be unguarded." Vala followed him closely, every step measured and deliberate. Her senses were on high alert, every shadow a potential threat, every creak in the silence an echo of something waiting to strike. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the place felt. She could almost hear the walls closing in on them. They reached a set of reinforced doors at the end of the corridor. Hayes swiped a data pad across the reader, and after a tense moment, the doors hissed open, revealing a large central control room. The room was empty. At least it appeared so, but the screens lining the walls flickered with activity. "This is it," Hayes said, moving quickly to the nearest terminal. He plugged a device into the port, his fingers flying across the keys. "We'll grab everything we can." Vala kept her back to the door, scanning the room for any signs of movement. The silence was unbearable, each passing second drawing out the tension. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her. This could be the break they needed, or it could be their last. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move. Too fast, too fluid. Before she could react, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went black. Vala's heart pounded in her chest. "Hayes," she hissed, drawing her blade. A voice crackled over the darkened intercom. It was smooth, almost disinterested, but there was something chilling in its tone. "You should have stayed away, Commander Hayes. You've already stepped into something you don't understand." Ramps up the tension as they enter the black site and begin their mission, only for things to take a sharp turn. The discovery of an enemy presence, along with the ominous voice on the intercom, heightens the sense of danger and mystery. The stakes are raised, and Vala and Hayes are about to face an enemy they weren't prepared for. "Let me know what you think." The lights flickered again, casting long shadows that stretched across the cold, metallic floor. Vala's pulse quickened as the oppressive silence seemed to swallow them whole. Hayes was still bent over the terminal, his eyes glued to the screen, unaware of the danger creeping closer, but Vala wasn't as distracted. Her senses were on high alert, her fingers tight around the hilt of her blade as she scanned the room, every muscle poised for action. "Hayes," she whispered, her voice urgent, "we've been made." His head snapped up at the sound of her voice. Before he could say anything, the lights flickered once more, then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound now was the harsh, uneven breath in Vala's chest. She felt the weight of the dark press down on her like a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Then came the hiss of metal scraping on metal, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Deliberate, slow, heavy. "Who's there?" Hayes demanded, his voice tense but controlled, as he reached for the weapon at his side. Vala moved instinctively to position herself between him and the door. The floor beneath her feet was cold, but her senses burned with focus. There was a faint sound, like a faint whisper against the hum of the ventilation system. Someone was watching them. A voice echoed through the intercom again, smooth but cold, almost mechanical. "You shouldn't have come here, Commander. And you certainly shouldn't have brought this Rithian with you." Vala's chest tightened at the mention of her people. She knew that voice. It was familiar, too familiar. A voice she had hoped to never hear again. The leader of the covert organization pulling the strings behind the war. The one who had killed her comrades, who had orchestrated the ambush. the one who had set everything in motion. You? Her voice caught in her throat, but she forced the words out. You're behind this. The voice chuckled, a low, hollow sound that sent chills down her spine. Did you think it was just about money, little scout? No, it's about power, control, your people, your war. It's all just part of a larger plan, and now you're both in my hands. The lights snapped back on abruptly, and for a moment, everything was too bright, blinding. And then Vala saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, masked soldiers, their rifles raised, eyes cold with intent. Move, Hayes barked, reaching for his sidearm, but Vala was already 2 steps ahead. She lunged toward the nearest soldier, her blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. The soldier didn't have time to react before Vala's strike landed, taking him out of the fight in one clean motion. She twisted around just in time to deflect a second soldier's rifle swing, using his momentum against him to bring him down in a brutal takedown. But there were more of them, more than she could handle alone. Hayes was firing now, his weapon flashing in the dim light. But it wasn't enough. They were surrounded. You think you can stop me? The voice crackled again, louder this time, reverberating through the room's speakers. You're too late. The war has already been set in motion. It doesn't matter who lives or dies now. Vala gritted her teeth, sweat beading on her forehead. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to destroy the very forces that had manipulated her people, her entire race, for years. We're not done yet, she muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the room for any way out. Hayes was still fighting, his shots ringing out, but it was clear, if they didn't get out of here fast, they wouldn't make it. Suddenly, the intercom cut out. The voice stopped. There was no time to question it. Vala's sharp gaze landed on an escape hatch on the far side of the room. It was their only chance. Hayes, move, she shouted. Without waiting for a response, she bolted toward the hatch, her body moving on instinct. Hayes was right behind her, firing back at their attackers as they sprinted toward the exit. The soldiers were closing in, but they had no choice. If they stayed any longer, they would be trapped. Vala reached the hatch first and punched in the override code she'd picked up earlier from one of the data terminals. It slid open just as a round whizzed past her ear, grazing her shoulder. She gritted her teeth and jumped into the darkened shaft beyond, pulling Hayes in after her. The hatch slammed shut behind them, and for a moment they were in total darkness again. The only sound was their labored breathing, the cold metal of the escape tunnel pressing against them as they moved quickly, silently. Keep going, Vala hissed. We're not out yet. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and turning in a way that felt almost designed to confuse. But Vala's instincts were sharper now, honed by years of survival. She knew how to navigate chaos, how to keep moving even when the world seemed intent on swallowing her whole. As they reached a junction in the tunnel, a faint light from a distant exit flickered ahead. We're almost there, Hayes said, his voice tight with urgency. But Vala didn't let up. She couldn't. They weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. The voices of their enemies were already beginning to echo down the corridor behind them. They would not stop, but neither would she. The tension peaks with the confrontation in the black site, culminating in a fight for their lives. The revelation of the true enemy, someone Vala recognizes, adds an emotional depth to the conflict, and the urgency to escape builds to an intense climax. Their journey is far from over, but they've taken the first step toward uncovering the truth. Let me know how you feel about the direction.